Hello, everybody. I am Lara Wellman, and I am the host of Let's Talk About That. I'm a business coach, and I wanted to have conversations that weren't always about business. And so I am doing this show every other Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we get to talk about all the things that I just think we should talk about more. And I am inviting some friends to come and join that conversation with us because again, it's just a lot of fun to have these conversations. So I'm going to introduce my three guests, and then we're going to talk about some of the ways that society has taught us to hate ourselves and even gaslight ourselves. So first, I've got Jeff Harry. Jeff combines positive psychology and play to heal workplaces. Jeff was selected by Bamboo HR and Engagedly as a top 100 HR influencer and has been featured in the New York Times, Mashable, Shondaland, and Wired. We also have Robin Whitford. Robin is a passionate artist, rug hooking teacher, Oxford certified instructor, and creativity mentor. Robin loves to share her passion for all things hooking related with those who are curious to try new things and connect with others, all while making rugs. And then we have Dimple Dabalia, who is the founder of Roots in the Clouds and the creator and co-host of the podcast, What Would Ted Lasso Do? With Jeff. Dimple brings more than 20 years of experience working at the crossroads of leadership, culture, and belonging, crafting strategy and designing psychologically safe, human-centered workplace cultures across high human impact sectors. Welcome, all three of you. I'm super excited to have you here. This is the second episode of Let's Talk About That because I just, like I said, I just want to talk about more things. I think there's all kinds of things. As a business coach, I get to bring a lot of it in, but there's just so many things I want to learn more about. I think we all as a society need to have bigger conversations around. And I know so many interesting and cool people that I can bring into conversations like this. So thank you. So what we're going to be doing is talking about the ways that society's kind of taught us to hate ourselves. I feel like there are so many ways, and it can be in so many areas of our lives that we catch ourselves feeling really bad about ourselves. And whether or not we've noticed, it kind of comes from how we've been taught to think about ourselves or not. It's there. And I am starting to notice it. So I wanted to have a bit of a conversation about that and how we find ourselves kind of feeling gross about ourselves. So does anybody want to volunteer to go first and just kind of say, even when I said, hey, do you want to talk about this? What did it bring up and what did it make you think? Jeff, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So the idea of society hating, why has society gotten us to hate ourselves and gaslight ourselves? I thought the part for me that was really interesting was the word society, because I don't think it's society. I think it's a small group of people, because I think most people kind of agree that a majority of the stuff that we feel like is we're getting gaslit, that it's a lot of BS, that we are like propaganda that's put it out to us. And being like I'm a play person, I think about, when I was a kid, I was constantly told no. I heard no, kids here by the time they turn age of 18, they've heard the word no 9,000 times. Constantly when I'm in school, I was told to sit down, raise my hand, not speak. So it's this whole, so then of course, throughout this whole time, we've been told not to rock the boat. So no wonder we feel a certain way, because we've been told we're not enough. And the only way we're going to be enough if we buy more stuff from Amazon and binge watch more Netflix. So it's that's the propaganda, because that's the way in which it gets us to buy more things. But most of society actually doesn't believe any of that. I think we've been tricked into believing it. That's my take.
Well, and I think you're right? I think it's that we are tricked into thinking it's right? So there was a few people who maybe made the first calls, right? They're the ones who are this is how it should be. And now we're yeah, oh, obviously, okay. And then we keep that going.
Well, and when I saw the sort of topic for today, I got hooked on the gaslighting part, because I feel like that for me has been such a when I even learned about the term, wasn't that long ago, like maybe 10 years ago or whatever, when I first heard that. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many places where it's like, you hear like, oh, take care of yourself, you know, be gentle on yourself, but be perfect and do everything perfectly and have your house, like, you know, so that for me, the more I become aware of it, and it's the same. I mean, I get that with propaganda, like, you know, you're not good enough until you have all of these things, but then you have all these things. Now you need more things. So it's like, what? Like, it's impossible. Like, it's just, we're set up for the impossible. And I think that's such an important thing for people to learn about so that we don't feel like we're crazy or like we're the ones that are lacking or not able to keep up. Like, we are in fact in a world. That's why I agree with the society in the sense that our very generalized society doesn't at every turn fight this. Instead, we most of the time sit back and go, okay, it's okay. Like, and we believe it to an extent that we don't prevent it from continuing or propagating or whatever enough, except in these conversations. So thank you, Lara.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. Like, I think for me also, the gaslighting piece really caught my attention. So a lot of the work I do is around creating spaces of belonging. And I think the idea of gaslighting just automatically is a form of othering, right? Because when we are gaslit, we automatically feel like, oh, there's something I'm doing, or, you know, something's wrong with me. And there's so much of that. And I get what Jeff is saying. Like, I agree that I think when we think about like the systemic issues that are out there, they start with a really small group of people, and it's generally like white men, right? That it's like, that's where it has started. And it has gotten into so much of how we like show up and experience the world. And so, but I think part of that then is it's become such a norm that like there's parts of it that we don't even notice are happening. And but it's just created a lot of stories kind of, you know, about how we're expected to show up. Another thing we've been kind of been thinking about a lot is like this idea of professionalism. Like, what does it mean to be a professional and how we show up as professionals? And I think there's a lot in that has just been like so steeped. It's like so deep in the culture now that, you know, it's hard to Robin's point, to like have those discussions, because sometimes we don't even realize, like, you know, that it's something that maybe isn't feeling good. It's become part of how we are.
And starting to realize that some of the things we've been doing are maybe not so cool, or like all of those things can be really hard to accept sometimes. So then I notice it so much, all of the things I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I've accepted that's true. And then you say it to somebody who hasn't, and they're like, no, that's wrong. That's how it should be. That's right. Like, it's so interesting to just see how many things feel like unbreakable rules to people, and that they're correct, right? Like, they've internalized it so much. It's not like what we're doing is correct. I'm not wrong. I haven't made a mistake. This is the proper way. This is the good way. This is how we must do things. And then it becomes so difficult to separate yourself from that, to be like, well, how do I look at it differently?
Yeah, it makes me think of, like, you know, perfectionism is like rooted in like white male supremacy, right? It's like a key part of constantly trying to be right or wanting to be right. And I think of the story that I heard when I was doing my positive psychology program, where they talked about right after World War II, many Americans were just so happy that they were alive. You know, they had survived the war, and a lot of people were like going outside and camping and doing all these things, going to the beach and all this stuff. But the government, as well as many corporations, were concerned because people weren't spending enough money. They were doing all these leisure activities, but these leisure activities were not producing the amount of production they did during the war. So there was a concerted effort to create a propaganda machine that made it seem like, hey, maybe you should move to the suburbs. And while you're moving to the suburbs, you get a production they did during the war. Oh, is that? I don't know what that was. But yeah, but there was the concerted effort to make people feel as if they didn't have enough stuff and the stuff was going to bring them happiness when they were already enjoying their happiness. And then people bought into that. They moved to the suburbs, and there was this whole push then to really find your happiness through consumerism. And that just hasn't changed. We've just gotten really good at it, to the point now that people will actually go shopping as therapy. Like that'll be part of their, so we're so layered in it now, but it comes from not too long ago, from like, less than maybe 80 years ago.
Yeah. And we've really bought in. And that's, down to the one of the ways that I was thinking about that is so big for me is like internalizing fat phobia, and like what you look like, all of the ways that you see what it is to be beautiful, what it is to be acceptable, what it is to look professional, right? I started working in offices in the 90s. I was like 19 when I first went and bought my first little power suit, because you got to wear a suit if you're going to work. I was like a receptionist and I needed a suit. It's just like, what is it to be proper and to look good and for people to accept you and for people to trust you and for people like, why does what I'm wearing change how competent you think I am?
Well, and I think it's a fair question. I think it really like leads to the question about like our standards of beauty, right? Like we see them starting to evolve, but like, it's still, there's still very particular things that people consider to be beautiful, right? And so part of that is like, I think that's very much connected to, the way that we see people on the outside and then there's assumptions that we make about how we think their capability or, what they're going to be able to contribute or do. And a lot of this, I think, it goes back to this idea of awareness, right? Like we operate on autopilot a good chunk of the day. And so if we don't have awareness of how like our own biases and blind spots that are showing up, then like we see people all day long and we make assumptions all day long sometimes without even realizing it. And so part of it is like wanting to take accountability by bringing that awareness in. And, to what you were saying, Laura, like just building on that idea of accountability, and people getting upset when you kind of raise issues, especially these days. I think a lot of things are polarizing anyway, but like when you start to have these conversations, things are so deeply ingrained that people get offended and they get upset. And part of it is because none of us wants to think like, oh, well, I'm part of the problem and I'm a bad person or whatever. And so in a lot of and I'm sure Jeff probably does this too, but in a lot of like the equity, inclusion, belonging work, like part of it is having that conversation to say like, look, acknowledging that this is happening doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's like the book Cast, it has Isabel, oh gosh, I forgot her last name. I'll have to look it up, but has a beautiful thing at the beginning where she talks about how when it comes to things like systemic racism and stuff, it's like a house that we've inherited, right? And so when you inherit something, like it's not your fault that it is the way that it is, but you then have a choice, right? Like you can change, you can renovate. Like in the house, you can renovate, you can like clean things up, you can fix them. And so we are at this point now where it's kind of like we've inherited this thing. We're finally starting to acknowledge it, that it's there. And so what kind of role do you want to play? And like taking accountability doesn't mean that, you have done all of this, but once you have got that awareness and once it becomes clear that like this is what is there, then if you don't take any action, then you're helping to perpetuate it, And so, yeah.
I think people get so upset too because it is so ingrained and there's so many layers of it that like when you peel in one corner, like the fat phobia or like looks and beauty, like that's one little area. And then you go into the capitalism, like white supremacy, all that, like that's a whole other, and it's scary. Like for me anyway, when I start peeling at it, it can be really overwhelming and really kind of like scary in the sense of like, how is it going to look? Because I don't know. Like if we start peeling these things away, like what will it look like if we rebuild? And, as individuals with not a lot of safe places to talk about this in the big picture kind of stuff, at least not in my world, it's kind of like, eeks, like help. So yeah, I love the idea of talking about it because there's so many layers and so much needs to be rebuilt in our houses. I think.
What comes up for me is I feel the biggest way in which we've been lied to or gaslit is the propaganda around you are alone, right? That and that if you buy something or you go somewhere, then you'll be better. Then happiness is over there. It's not here. Happiness is over there. And I'm currently putting together like this workshop that I'm going to run at WDS around with my friend Sarah Serrani around embracing fear from a we space instead of a me space. Because I think a lot of times whenever we get scared, and I think this is part of the American capitalistic propaganda, is it really makes you feel as if you have to figure it out all on your own, right? But when you think of like any natural disaster that happens, what happens? The community comes out. Everyone comes out. People, when my dad died, like people came out of the woodwork that I didn't even know still knew I was alive, right? And when you see that community there, then you realize like, oh, I don't need these other things to bring me happiness. I just really need to tap into my community and my connections and my friends. Having said that, I recently was like traveling abroad and I saw these people getting drunk and I was like sitting there wondering, I was just like, why is everyone out? What are they doing? Why are they out? Oh, what are they looking for? They're looking for belonging. They're looking for connection. Maybe they're looking for a little adventure as well, but they're out because of that, right? But I was like, they are getting drunk, spending hundreds of dollars with the small chance that maybe they meet some random stranger and something magical happens, right? They could also just simply sit with their friends and look them in the eye for like 3 minutes straight and have one of the most in silence, right? 3 minutes in silence. They would have the most vulnerable, powerful connection experience they've had like all year. Would they do that? No, they'd rather get drunk and do all these other things to get the connection that they could get with a friend right now. And that's where I find this to be just fascinating. And I feel so gaslit by this.
I think the whole I should be able to do it alone piece is really ingrained in us, right? Like no matter how many times somebody's like, ask me if you need help, right? I think this goes all the way back to school. Like if you have any questions, I'm happy to help you. But then how many times have you heard how impressive it is when somebody did something without needing help, right? So they did it all, but they didn't need anything. They didn't need anybody to help them. Like, there you go. I'm like, why is that better than being able to do something collaboratively and like maybe just like learn from each other at the same time? But this whole like, you need to ultimately show me that you're strong, show me that you're capable, show me that you're smart, show me that you don't need help, is so ingrained in all of us that's why, right? I'm okay, right? Even when I'm not okay. No, I'm okay. No, I don't need help. No, when I was sick, I was like, no, I'm okay. No, I don't need help. I don't need you to bring me somewhere. Like me asking for somebody to drive my kids somewhere when I was in like this massive pain was like this huge thing for me. And it shouldn't have to be, but it's like that. I'm okay. I don't need help. I just think it's everywhere. And so that's where we end up trying to convince ourselves, all right, you're okay. It's not a big deal. Why are you making this thing a big deal? It's not even like I'm saying that to myself. It's not like all of you are out here. All of you would be like, no, Lara, like it's okay if you need help. But I'm like, no, I'm fine. And that's the kind of stuff I think because you don't even notice it.
And that, I think, to me is the core, like the cornerstone of keeping all of these things happening, is that we keep it to ourselves until we break, like until some crisis happens and you're like, I can no longer function. And, you know, many of us have had those stories where it's like, okay, now I need to call in the whatever Calvary, because this is not going to survive any longer as is. But I think if we start talking about it, that is sort of chipping away at the crazy making, like the gaslighting of it. Is if you and I and other people listening, you know, start having these conversations with their friends about whatever issues they're struggling with, then we realize we're not alone and we don't have to do it alone. And that other people are all struggling, because I feel like that's the other thing our society, again, generalizing over the top, or the propaganda, is like, everybody else is fine. What's wrong with you? Like, why can't you manage this? And I mean, in my life, it was, I'm having flashbacks. My husband was military and I worked for military family services. And I used to think that, you know, the public affairs officers that, you know, put out the pretty pamphlets and stuff, like they should be getting awards, because they were so good at making the families, and I say, you know, like these picture models that they were hiring to put in pamphlets, so happy and perfect. And I was like, I don't know these people. And I am a military family and I work with military families. And I'm like, but that's what we believe. So you get that at home and, you know, and you're like, oh, well, they got it all together and, you know, everything's just fine for them. So I just need to be more resilient. I just need to take a bath, and a little self-care and everything's fine. Whereas once you start talking to other military families, in my case, it was like, oh, okay, that's like that at your house too. Phew. So yeah, I think talking about it is so important, and knowing that we're not alone, even when we are being told we're alone or we tell ourselves we're alone, we got to break that. That's just part of the cycle we got to break, is we're not alone.
Yeah. I agree with both of you. And I think Brene Brown talks about how, like, you know, in that silence, like that's where shame really grows and lives, right? And so much of, I think, what we experience individually and collectively, like it's in that space of shame. It's in that space of trauma. Because I think like trauma is another word that people are like, oh no, I don't have trauma, you know. But we talk about like big T trauma. Yeah, most of us probably don't have a lot of big T traumas, you know, maybe once in our lifetime or a few times in our lives. But we have these little T traumas that are building up every single day, and cumulatively, like they are impacting us. And so, you know, to your point about the resilience, Robin, like I think this is a big problem, right? Like, especially through the pandemic and stuff. We heard a lot of this. I know, like, even in my former workplace, there was a lot of like, oh, we have the most resilient group of people. And I was like, and I had originally created a program to try to help build resilience, like, you know, but the more that I started reading about it and learning about it, I was like, okay, we're doing this the wrong way. And so I would start going back to leaders to say, stop telling people they're resilient. Because we're creating this situation where they're going to, like, people feel like they can't then ask for help, because there's this thing like, oh, well, you're all resilient. You're good. So now it's like, okay, now I have this pressure because I think that everyone else is doing great. That even if I need the help, I'm not going to ask, or I'm going to feel ashamed to ask, you know? And so, and then I think, of course, like social media just makes that worse, because everyone's putting up like the best parts of their lives, as we know. And now we see more people putting up the worst parts of their lives. But even that often feels kind of staged and scripted and whatever, right? Rather than the true vulnerability that we're looking for. And it is curious, like the getting drunk piece, Jeff, like because, you know, it makes you wonder, right? Like where people are at, and like how people, because all of these are nervous system reactions, right? Like we react in certain ways when we have certain patterns that we follow, and we do certain things repeatedly until we bring the awareness to realize, like, oh, this is my pattern. What do I want to do to change it? And so it's not about saying like, you know, oh, well, they shouldn't do that or whatever, but like just a recognition, like, okay, yeah, you know what, that's how they're showing up. It is really curious as to why and what those patterns say about how they've gone through life and things like that. But um, the other piece of this that really came up for me in the original, like when I saw your topic, was, you know, going back to this idea of trauma and resilience, like especially in a lot of these helping professions, you know, that if you're part of a mission-driven organization, that the mission comes above everything else, right? And so I know in my line of work, when I was working with asylum seekers and refugees, and there was this sense that, you know, we often would compare our lives to theirs to say like, oh, well, who am I to complain when I've just interviewed someone who has lost everything in the world and can't go home? And, you know, but it's all relative. Like my pain is my pain and my suffering is my suffering. And so it's not that, well, because theirs is worse, I should just keep my mouth shut. It's like all of this, you know, so all of this is impacting the people who are doing the work. And so you look at medical professionals, you look at clergy, you look at people in the humanitarian sector. We're all doing this work and we're taking it in and we're putting other people before us. And we've been told that, you know, you're resilient, you're strong, you signed up to do this work, but it doesn't, like, we're human. At the end of the day, we're human. And so it is going to impact us. And we do need to be able to consider our well-being and all of that when in order to like be healthy and happy and a part of the bigger society.
Oh,
Oh,
I don't know if Robin meant to leave. Hopefully she'll be right back. I'm like taking notes now. I'm like, I have more things to say and I don't want to forget them. And if other people say things, but there's a bunch of things. One of them that came up while somebody was talking was around you're okay and your feelings, right? Like, but we've taught to be like, you're okay, right? Like when your kid falls down, you're like, it's okay, you're okay, don't worry about it, you're fine. Not like, it's like, I mean, it's okay to be upset, right? Like we've all been taught to sort of squash down our feelings and not feel them. And so we're not very good at feeling them and then letting ourselves do something with that. And so when we feel like we need to be okay all the time and we don't even recognize when we're not okay because we've been taught to like pretend it's not true, no wonder. And so one of the things when I was saying like we should have this conversation is like, what do we tell people to do about this? Because it's not like so yeah, it sucks, we all hate ourselves, life is terrible, the end, right? Like there's but we also can't solve it in a conversation. And so that's where I think, right, it's already come up, but that noticing, just acknowledging that it's happening and starting to let yourself say like, okay, that's the first step, is at least acknowledging that it's happening, and I'm going to start to make changes. I know for me, I still have that tendency. Once I see a problem, I want it to be solved right away, but like I can't solve all the things immediately. So start noticing so that we can start making changes. The other thing we can come back and I'm just like, I want to say all the things, but in terms of like the how hard is it and how we all perceive things, yeah, all the different levels of hard are still hard. And one of the things that it bring to mind is I had a year where I was very sick. I had to go to the hospital, to the ER a few times in pain. And I remember going, they're like, what's your pain level? And I was like, it's a 10. I have never been in this much pain again. And then I came back a month later and they're like, what's your pain level? I was like, it's a 10. I would like to change last time's answer. Right? Both times it was just the most pain I'd ever been in, right? Like I was at top level hard. And so it was top level for me in that moment, just because somebody else didn't experience it that way. And just because it couldn't be harder didn't still make it top level hard the first time. And acknowledging that we have all those things instead of constantly being like, somebody else has it worse, I'm okay, is what I think happens.
Well, and when people, I don't know how the ER responded to you, Lara, and I hope it was really supportive. But in my experience, when I've been in incredible pain, but not cut open and bleeding everywhere, people don't quite know. Like, it's kind of, I got several pats on the back, or, you know, like, it'll be okay kind of, even though I might have been at that moment at, you know, my top level. Thankfully, it wasn't often. But I think, again, as society, we are so accustomed to, like, okay, we deal with a crisis. So the bloody body, you know, in the ER, okay, gets first. But as a community, like, I hope that we are getting better at recognizing each other's non-visible pain, and acknowledging it and supporting it, just like we would the open wounds. Because part of that is that crazy making feeling of, okay, I am hurting beyond, you know, anything I feel I can cope with, but everybody else thinks I'm fine because I'm looking okay. And that, to me, is like that. It's perpetuating the gaslighting. It's teaching, it's teaching people just suck it up, because if you tell somebody and they don't react in a supportive way, that to me is more crushing than keeping it to myself and suffering.
Yeah, when I think of what you said about the non-visible pain, I love that you said that, right? Because I feel like one of the biggest ways in which we've been gaslit for the last 2 years is we've never had the chance to process the pandemic, like, at all, right? And I think of, you know, when 9/11 happened, 2,977 people died, right? They had mournings basically every month, and then eventually there were yearly mournings, but there was this whole process for people to collectively talk about it, even if it didn't directly affect you. And then we had COVID, and I just looked it up, and it's just like over 1 million people have died, and at no point have we ever had a collective mourning period during this whole time. If anything, most companies are like, you got to get back to work. You got to start buying more products. That's been our way. And it's just like a whole 1 million people have passed away, and all of them, and in many cases, they would die with, like, holding up an iPad so they could see. So everyone feels as if they died alone, or they experienced a family member dying alone, even though it affected all of us in some way or another. And that just blows my mind that we haven't even sat down and talked about it in any capacity. And now we have to get back to work. And that is why so many people are like, this is BS. I don't want to go back to the office. I don't want to do these things. I don't want to do what I used to do pre-pandemic, because I didn't like how I was. And it wasn't bringing me a certain level of joy and fulfillment anyway. And I now got to sit during this time, and now I realize, like, all the stuff you were telling me was a lie.
Yeah. And I love what you just said, Jeff, because I think that grief is such a huge thing, and everyone experiences it differently. And so even though people make it seem like, you know, like all the things that have been, like, the key things that have been written about grief are like the stages, and it makes it seem very linear. We know that it's not. You know, anyone who's experienced a loss knows that it's not. But I also kind of keyed in on the non-visible pain. I think that that's such a beautiful way to put it. And like like you were saying, Lara, in terms of, like, we have been taught to, you know, like, oh, you're fine, you're fine. We have such a like tiny range of emotions we can access, because we haven't been taught to access the full range and to name them and to really acknowledge, like, okay, so when you see someone who's, like, angry and blowing up, there's probably something deeper, right? And so there's, like, it brings to mind that idea of the iceberg, where, you know, we only see the top part of the iceberg, but really it goes pretty deep into the water. And so it's the same thing with our emotions, that we see a lot of the surface level stuff. And so right now, like, all the stuff that we're seeing happening in the world, and, like, how people are reacting and the things that they're doing, it's all so surface level. But to your point, Jeff, about not actually, you know, digging deeper and, like, giving people the space to really experience that full range of emotions and recognize, like, oh, it's okay to feel this full range of emotions, again, because I'm a human being. Yeah, it's really hard. And it's not just individual grief, it's a collective grief, because it's 1 million people. That's just here in the US, right? Think about worldwide, right? So as like a global community,
Mhm.
not and the other thing is it's not just I mean the loss of life has been, I mean, just beyond anything any of us have experienced in our lifetimes, but it's also the loss of life as we once knew it, right? So we you think back to, like, they always say, like, with post-traumatic growth, it's like there's a dividing line, like life before the trauma happened and then life after. And I think 9/11's a great example, pandemic's a great example. There's such a clear line about what life was like before the event and what it's like now. And you think about how much more challenging everything is. Like even things like Jeff knows as late as last week, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to WDS because, like, I have so much anxiety about getting together with people, and I've never been like that. I've always been like super social and out there in the world and traveling. And so, yeah, like there's so many after effects that we don't even know yet because we're not taking the time to acknowledge or deal with them.
And we're all coming at it, right? Even then, from like they're the people who are like everything is fine, and everything is not fine, right? Like the whole, like all the people, the differing opinions that you have, and then how you feel like I'm going to be judged for still being scared. I'm going to be judged for not being scared. Like everything is big.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just another piece, right? The pandemic and the long-standing effects that are coming from it. But I do think it's given some people the opportunity to start saying, I don't want this anymore, right? The whole, like, I was on a path without paying attention. I just like, then the next thing I'm supposed to do. And I mean, this is stuff I talk about with my clients all the time in terms of what do you think success looks like, right? There was, for a long time, it's just like you go here and then you graduate, and then you want a job, and then you want to be the manager, and then you want a house, and then you want 2 cars, you want 2.5 kids. Like that's the goal.
But
like,
do you?
but do you? And stopping and trying to see if you actually want the things you're trying to achieve.
But that's
big.
Sorry, go ahead, Robin.
I am feeling really hopeful when I spend time with younger people right now, because I feel like I don't know how old you guys are, so I won't make generalizations, but in my friend group or what, like we definitely grew up with, like, you graduate high school, you go to university or college or whatever, you do this, you do that, and at some point we're supposed to be happy. And we are like, whoa, many of us in the last 10 years are like, okay, I missed something because I'm not feeling the happiness or the whatever I thought I was.
Yep.
Whereas my kids are almost 18 and 20. And I'm really hopeful that their generation is got things differently. I mean, it's not perfect. There's still lots of work to do, but already I'm feeling like some of the conversations I hear is like, they are like, oh, you want that? I want this. You want that? Okay, I'm going to do this. And yet they still hang out together, like, okay, they might be getting drunk, Jeff, but they're still having more interesting conversations about possibilities than I had at that age. So I'm really hopeful it will expand beyond that and sort of this kind of stuff too. Like I'm not buying into that crap of needing, everything from Amazon, or I'm not, like some of them, I don't know. I just think I am hopeful that conversations are a bit different than they were for my gang.
Whenever I talk to people about accomplishments or I'm working with clients around that, I always like say, okay, Michael Phelps won 28 medals.
Yeah.
28. And then he went into depression. Like no one could win more stuff or get more stuff than that. So, Anthony Bourdain had the job everyone wants, travel the world, and eat and connect with people. Not enough. So again, and I agree with you, Robin, because like I spent a ton of my time on TikTok, and when you see how people are just rejecting, I don't want to do the 9 to 5 anymore. I want to work 4 days a week, or maybe I don't even want to work 4 days a week. I want to work 3 days a week. The amount of clients I've talked to that are like, I don't even want to work. Like, can I figure out a way to not do this anymore? Like, do I have to? Why? I need to make this video, but someone's just like made a video where he was just like, why do I have to pay to live on this planet? Like, that makes no. Who am I paying so that I can live on this planet? And this goes back to what we said earlier of like, there's a small group of people where this is working out for them.
Yeah.
And then everyone else is like doing stuff and just being like, it kind of reminds me of when I was in like 7th grade and was like, these are the cool kids. Who determined that these people over here are the cool kids?
Yeah.
Their example of being cool is not fun at all. Why do I have to put mousse in my hair and wear Cavaricis because Mark told me to? Like, it's mind-boggling that, so I think going to like a solution-oriented part, I think it's a combination of reminding ourselves we're not alone, calling out people's BS, calling out the BS. That is done really well on TikTok. Just like, nah, I don't want to do that. And really, whenever you feel disconnected, like, reach out to your community and remind yourself that other people know this is bullshit.
Well, and I don't know about you, but I love this, Lara, that you're doing things like this, because again, maybe I'm late to the game and I believed all the stories until a few years ago. But I want more people like you guys in my life. And I know well, it's not easy for an introvert like me to go out and meet new people, I feel like. So I feel like we need to come up as again, using generalized society, more opportunities, and things like WDS sound like awesome events for connecting with similarly like-minded but differently minded people. And that will help us to move forward. Because if I just stuck to my small network and thought, okay, I'm going to tell them that this is BS, like, well, I'm not going to have too many friends left.
Yeah.
If I go around pointing out that they bought into the capitalist blah, 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 that I no longer want to support or something. So to find people that you can talk to and call each other out, or, say, hey, I think you're doing whatever, or that's not easy. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. So I welcome tips.
I completely agree. And one of the things that, so Jeff and I are doing this podcast now called What Would Ted Lasso Do, where we, look at the show Ted Lasso, which if people haven't watched it, it's phenomenal. And we look at it through this lens of leadership and positive psychology and stuff. But one of the like underlying kind of themes to the show is curiosity, right? Like, I think that we, again, go through life. When we operate on autopilot, we go through life just making assumptions all day long, right? So we're making assumptions, and that's what creates those walls a lot of times. Because if we make assumptions, and they're assumptions that about things that don't feel good to us, we're not even going to give the other person a chance. And so to your point, like, yeah, I have my little bubble of people and I can share my views and they're all going to be like, yeah, you're right. Like, this is, I completely agree. And, and then I go out into the real world and I'm like, this is scary. Like this is different. And so part of this is like, how do we bring more of that curiosity into our daily lives and into our conversations, especially with people who we don't necessarily we don't think we agree with, right? And what's interesting is that like, oftentimes there's something that connects us. There's something that is similar or that we can agree on or whatever. And maybe it's about like starting to find those little pieces and then expanding the conversation to understand where other people are coming from. And I'm not saying that's easy. Like I really struggle with that. Like I think it's really hard, especially in, like the toxic kind of culture we're in right now. It's really challenging, but I do think to like, again, from that solutions side of things, like the curiosity is, it's priceless, and it also takes a little bit of the personal out of it, I guess, because I know like in my leadership role, when I actually really started to put curiosity into play, it stopped being personal. It was really like, that, like, why are they doing that? Like, I really don't understand, and you want to learn more and figure it out. And so, yeah, I think that that's actually a really big piece of it.
And a lot of people who don't agree with the things I agree with, I mean, they really think they're on the right track, right? Like, I don't think all of them are like, no, because I hate the world. They're like, no, this is the only solution. This is how things have to work. You don't understand. And it's
Yeah.
like, maybe you don't understand. And then like yelling, you don't understand at each other, it doesn't help, but it's how you both feel, right? Because it just feels like you're in this like conversation of like, I can't find any commonality, but ultimately it really is. Everybody's like, this is the way that we're going to be okay. This is the way we're going to be, like, this is how it has to be. And so wanting that safety and that security for yourself and your community is basically what I think most of us want. We just have very different views on how we're going to get there. And then change is hard. I am a lot more comfortable than many people with change, which I think helps in this situation. And starting to say like, no, what I thought before wasn't right. And some of those things are big things. But the next episode in 2 weeks of Let's Talk About That is all about hustle culture and hard work, because like I think like it's thought to be that, revered thing. And Jeff, like you mentioned, people are like, what if I don't want to work? And for the longest time, I was like, I'm pretty lazy. And I really I totally was like, I am a lazy person. And people are like, what? Like all these things. I was like, yeah, but you know what I also really like to do is watch a lot of Netflix. I like to not work sometimes. So obviously, if I like to not work sometimes, I'm a lazy person, because people who aren't lazy they always want, like, you want to work harder.
Yeah.
So now you have this judgment on yourself versus like choosing.
Well, I just had this conversation with my sister about like, why do we think that work has to be painful or difficult? Right? Like, why can't it be? So Laura, sorry, like I'm exactly the same way, right? Like when I was thinking about this podcast, I was like, I don't know, like I'm watching TV and like talking about a TV show, like this feels really like too easy, and this is not, and this is a project, this is not work, but it's like, yeah, it is. Like I'm just because it's something that I'm enjoying, just because and one of the things that, and Robin, what you were talking about, I went through my whole life being told like my dad used to do prayers with me at night, and he'd be like, he'd be like calling out things like, dear God, please make me a doctor or an engineer. So like from a very young age, like that's, I was expected to like go down a certain path, and I did it. And I'm grateful. Like my career has been awesome. Like I don't have any complaints about that, but I am learning now that I think I was always meant to be a creative. Like that is really like at the heart of everything that I do. And I'm a good writer, and, like all these things that I'm working on now, and taking the time now to be like, what is it that I actually want to do? Like even that feels like shameful to do, because people are like, oh, you left your job and you started your own thing. So like, do you have a lot of clients? And you feel compelled to be like, yeah, I've got plenty of clients. I'm busy. I'm making, but it's like, yeah, but you know what? Like, I don't want to do any of that right now. Like, I want to focus and just like spend time thinking about this and figuring it out. And even that, like, we've just been conditioned in such a way for such a long time,
I think of this webinar that I once went to called Whiteness at Work from Desiree Adaway. And in it, she brought up this really good point about how we measure productivity in the workplace. And she was like, it's very similar to how they measure productivity on like slave plantations. It's the same type of output that, you have like the person that's running the whole plantation, but then you have the overseer, which is the middle management, and they produce a certain amount, and they don't care how they produce it, how they treat their their workers or whatever it is, as long as they produce and they get promoted that way. And we really haven't changed the way in which we measure productivity since then, right? Who cares if you stay long? I care about using you until you get burnt out. A lot of companies actually enjoy that. Amazon does that all the time. People don't even last more than a few months at the warehouse. My nephew lasted like 1 month at a warehouse and he was in good shape. But then I think of what was it? The other part about it. I think now I forgot it. But yeah, it's just burnout. I recently made a video where I was like, I talked to all these HR teams and I talk to all these companies and they constantly talk about their staff being burnt out. And I'm like, they're not burnt out. They're done. They're just done. Like no vacation or leave is going to address the fact that they don't want to be there anymore. And I shared this in an HR group and they did not like that because talk about like, well, what do you want us to do? Like they want to get back to the way things were. And someone finally spoke up and was just like, well, what do you want? What suggestions do you have to, another world, right? Because a lot of like supremacy hates curiosity. It hates like challenging that. And I just started throwing out random things where I was just like, what about a 4-day work week? What about on-site childcare or just paying for childcare? What about, supporting people as they're having, if they're getting adoptions or things like that, right? Like, why are we in a model where, have we not looked at like universal basic income? Like there's so many other ways in which we can do this. And the way we've come up with, most people don't like. So it's just like, how did we get here? And why have we not used curiosity to challenge these frameworks, especially when most people are not enjoying the ride?
And we get to enjoy things, right? Like to this point about the podcast, you're like, is this work when it's fun? Like not only yes, but like people are probably going to enjoy it more. It's going to be easier for you to produce. You're going to have fun doing it and people are going to want to listen to it. One of the most like shared posts I did a couple months ago was when I wrote like 5 things I learned from playing Wordle, right? And it's because I was like, it just came to me while I was sitting on the couch because I love playing Wordle every day. And like it applies. It's like super fun. And like it doesn't have to be serious. And not only does it not have to be, like, none of like, I don't know if you remember reading stuff 20, 30 years ago, but it was boring, right? Like fall asleep on any, company's stuff. Like they're like, take all personality out of it. This is the best way. It's the most professional. I'm like, but now I don't want to read it. I fell asleep reading your thing. So if it's fun, people might pay attention and actually get something out of it. It's not only not bad, it's better.
What made me think of too is like for me growing up, it was thinking of your prayers in the morning. We did not have that at my house, thankfully. But I got into 2 universities. One was to do like become a teacher and one was to go to fine arts school. And at the time it was like, wow, I got into fine arts school, but that's a hobby. Like that is, and it took me till I was over 40 and completely burnt out from my government job to now I do art full time. But it took a lot of therapy. And I mean, that's my white privilege and because I was working. And anyway, I was very lucky to have access to that most people don't have. But was to realize so much of the thing that I had absorbed from my family, from the community, whatever, was work made you sort of earn your spot. Like I felt to be a good person, like a contributing member of society, I needed to work. And work meant blood, sweat, and tears. And I didn't become a teacher, but I did do social work and I did that in military families and stuff. And I sweat and I cried. There was no blood, thankfully. But and so when I realized I could no longer do that, like physically, mentally, I was really struggling with, well, how do I contribute? I have to contribute. Like here I am 40 something and I need to earn my place. I need to be a good person. And I couldn't for years, like it took me really sort of working at this and again, from a very privileged place, to find that, okay, I can contribute to society by having fun. I can contribute to society by making space for other people to have fun and find their creative joy. But it took a lot of work to get there. And so many people I know, and even people that come to me for classes and stuff, it's just like they're just opening their eyes to that possibility. And many of them are retired now, and they're like, I wish I had that possibility, much younger. Because again, that idea that we believed, or I believed, and many still believe, that you need to work like your adult years, and then after retirement, then you can enjoy life, or you can do these nice creative hobbies as on your weekend or your time off, after you've done the real work and earned your keep, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I just think it's not going to be sustainable. Like, we can't keep doing this.
Yeah. And I think you touch on something that I think most of us have a common friend, Angie Cole, and she talks about this a lot, and I think this is another area of gaslighting, is this idea of productivity being tied to self-worth, right? Because like, we have to take those two things apart. And, and and it's not just productivity, it's this idea of busyness, right? So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people struggled also because it was like all those like extra things that they do like fell away. And now like you're like alone with your thoughts and like not easy. Right. And so, but yeah, like, so this idea that like what does it mean to actually just like be still and like be able to shave things off your calendar? So now like, ever since I left my job, like I don't use an alarm clock anymore. And I do everything possible to keep my calendar as light as possible. And it's like, it's hard because there are days where I feel like, well, none of this counts. Like, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. And it's like, yes, I am doing something, I'm actually doing plenty. I'm doing enough. I'm doing what I need to do. But there's just that voice that keeps popping up. And like, you have to like, actively fight against it to tell yourself like, no, you know what, it's okay. And yeah, like especially with creative things, like it's really, really hard to be able to even dream about like, oh, well, maybe I could be a writer full time, or maybe I could be a podcaster full time, or whatever, but there is this sense like, no, it has to be a certain way. It has to be a certain thing. And unless you're busy and unless you can show the world that you've got like too much going on, you're not worthy, and it's a tough thing to convince people of otherwise.
If ever I'm trying to convince organizations around this, I think of this Kevin Carroll, this play expert, introduced me to this quote from Stephen Johnson, where he says, "You'll find the future where people are having the most fun," right? And like that argument alone is how organizations thrive. That's how like people thrive. And just thinking of this, I recently saw this actor talking about this, and it's just like a lot of people don't value creativity in the arts. But when we were in the middle of the pandemic, and when people are going through death and suffering and pain and disconnect, they go to the arts. That's why a show like Ted Lasso or other things, I binge watched so much, and that was part of my therapy, right? So the more I feel we lean into that, the more we question when we feel like things are gaslit, and the more we remind ourselves that we're not alone, really helps to address this.
It's been an hour already. And so I think we're going to wrap it up. But I think, the key things that I pulled out of this were really, we're not alone. Remember, we're not alone. You don't need to try to do everything alone. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not want to do things the way that you always thought they were supposed to be. I think that's a thing in my work all the time. Just because you change what you want to do next doesn't mean you failed at what you were doing before. It's okay to just want to do something new now. It's okay to not want to keep going down the path you thought you were going to want to. That doesn't mean you suck and everything's terrible. And I think when we start to accept all of those things and notice, then we can start making the little changes that help us not just accept all the things that we feel terrible about anymore, right? Like that's just the way it is. Kind of feels like it's I don't. That's how it's always been. Is like no, never, right? If that's how it's always been, then it's time for change. Just keep moving forward with that. And I think if any of you have final thoughts, let's pull those up. I want to encourage people. I like to go and follow these lovely people. Their websites should all be findable where you're watching. Go and follow them, check them out. They're amazing. But if any of you have any other final thoughts as we wrap this up, I think it all leads really well into the fact that in 2 weeks from now, my conversation is going to be around hustle and hard work, because it really does tie to so much of that. So yeah, any final thoughts before we wrap this up quickly?
Yeah, I'll go. Going back to the thing I was talking about with Sarah earlier about a lot of times whenever we say things that we're really scared of, we go, I'm scared of this. I'm scared to start a podcast. I'm scared to quit my job. I'm scared to start a business. I'm scared, right? But when you change the language to like, we are scared or we are this, you start to realize that your community has already done it. And your community is already there to support you. And heck, you may even have family members or ancestors that have done things that are much scarier than you. Like my mom came over not knowing anyone. I can start a podcast. If she's doing that, I can do this small thing, right? So the more I think we tap into the we space, not only is that going to serve us well and remind us that we're not alone, but that's the we space where we tackle really important issues like climate change, like political division, like all of the things that we've been struggling with, because we finally realized that when I watch out for your back, I'm also watching out for me, and the more we get each other's back, the more we feel connected and feel whole.
Yeah, I love that, Jeff. And I would just add that the curiosity piece is a big one. And, to the extent that we can develop more self-awareness and awareness of what like our emotions are and what we're thinking and our biases, things like that. And then the second piece to that, though, is building self-compassion around it too. Because again, at the end of the day, we're all human. And just because we have biases, just because we have whatever's coming up doesn't mean that we're bad people. It's being human. So yeah. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
I'd have one last word too. And I was going to say curiosity, Dimple, because I do talk about that in my work, but I wasn't thinking about that in terms of this conversation until you brought it up before. But is community, like we need community. And as scary as that is for, well, at least I'm speaking for me, but the more I talk about things that I'm scared about, the more people I meet like you folks and other people that are like, oh, me too. So if anybody's listening and feels like they don't have a safe community, keep talking about it, because those other people will find you. Like you will find each other, because there's lots of people questioning right now, which is what I find exciting. I find the younger people exciting and give me hope, and other people who are just being more open and talking about those scary, uncomfortable stuff that, we don't want to follow the status quo anymore, gives me hope too that we'll be okay. So thank you, everybody.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining me. And then, everybody come and hang out with us more. We all want to talk to more of you, right? Come hang out with us and join me again in 2 weeks. I'm going to keep every 2 weeks talking about stuff. What it's going to be, I think we're going to kind of see what I feel like talking about, because that was the whole thing. I'm just going to talk about the things I feel like talking about. Thank all 3 of you for joining me, and we will see everybody in a couple of weeks.